Good morning. I acknowledge, and ACMI acknowledges, the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Bonwarren people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we meet, share and work. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people from all nations of this land. Welcome to day 2 of the Superheroes Beyond Conference. I'm Ewan on the public programs team here at ACMI. Sing out if you have any issues through the day, and we're here to help. Most of our panels today are in here and down in the cube space, which is off the Lightwell. And then this afternoon, the panels are in Cinema 2, which is just across the way on this level. And just a reminder, our keynotes and our public panels are live streamed, and the academic panels are audio recorded, so please wait for the microphone. We'd love to document your questions. And to kick off the day, I'm going to hand over to Liam Burke.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome to day 2, and I think we have a really great keynote to begin with. When we were kind of conceiving of the conference, and we wanted to kind of go beyond expected or obvious definitions of superheroes, then we thought about who the keynotes could be. You know, Trina came to mind, and so did Sheena, because Sheena's work, kind of like Trina's, but for perhaps a newer generation, looks at kind of superheroes that have kind of been overlooked and kind of forgotten spaces. And Sheena, who I got a chance to meet yesterday, is superheroic in herself, because 3 flights to get here, and your energy levels have not dipped an iota since you've arrived, so I think that's really impressive. So Sheena is the award-winning scholar, writer, documentary filmmaker. She's an associate professor of communication with a PhD from Howard University in intercultural and rhetorical communication. In 2014, Sheena became the first woman of color to win an Eisner Award, which I think we all know is tantamount to the Oscars of comics, so I think that's super impressive, at Comic-Con. For her book, Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation. She is the co-writer of the critically acclaimed comic book Superb, which you can get in the bookstore down below, and I'm sure Sheena will be happy to sign a few copies. The author-editor of the Encyclopedia of Black Comics, which you can also get below, and has featured in a range of media, films and documentaries on race, gender and sexual orientation. Sheena is the author of Black Queer Identity Matrix and the editor of Critical Articulations of Race, Gender and Sexual Orientation, and recently appeared in the documentary series Groundbreakers, Heroes Behind the Mask. So please join me in welcoming to Melbourne and the conference, Dr. Sheena C. Howard.
Right, let me just get my timer because I tend to not stop when I start. Good morning. I keep wanting to say good afternoon because it's 5:30 in Philadelphia, 5:30 p.m. in Philadelphia, where I'm from. But I'm certainly excited to be here, and certainly I want to thank the organizers of this conference and of this program for bringing me in to talk to you about my work, about comics, and particularly how I think I use comics as a sort of social impact tool to kind of make change and to kind of bring to the forefront some of the issues that I think we need to be focusing on. That is my Twitter handle up there. I am kind of really active on Twitter, so we'll have a Q&A session after I finish my remarks, but certainly if there's questions that you want to ask me that you don't get to ask today, certainly find me on Twitter, and I'm happy to kind of engage with you there as well. So today I want to get you to sort of think about kind of powerful ways that you can use the medium of comics. And this is really important to me because when I got into comics at first, I was just like, what is the point of all this? All right, they're like comic books, they're superheroes. Like, why is this important? What are we doing? And then as I really kind of got into the medium, I realized that you can really use it to tell some really powerful stories and to really change the way people think, to change the way we think about representation, but also to bring some sort of really important social issues to light. So that's kind of what I want to share with you today. And I want to do that just by talking about my work up until this point and how I sort of got into this field. So first of all, I started graduate school really, really young. So I started my PhD program when I was only 23, and that really shaped what I ended up researching and studying and how I ended up getting into comics. So, you know, when you're in a PhD program, it's all about this whole dissertation, this kind of book that you have to write. And in the program that I was in at Howard University in Washington, D.C., you know, from day one, they were like, you know, you have to know what you're going to study. What are you going to study? And I was like, I don't know. You know, I'm just here. I don't know what I want to do with my life. So being forced to pick a topic, I kind of looked at my surroundings and I thought, you know, well, what am I interested in right now? And as a 23-year-old, I just happened to be reading the Boondocks. So the Boondocks, has anybody ever heard of the Boondocks? Really? Oh, that's wonderful. So the Boondocks actually started out as a comic strip. And the people that are familiar with the Boondocks, which I'm gonna talk a little bit more about, actually turned into an animated television series, which was really, really, really popular. So most people know about the animated television series, which I hate, by the way, but I'll get into that. I'll get into that more. But I ended up doing my dissertation on the Boondocks comic strip because that is just what was in my life at that time, and I needed to pick a dissertation topic, and I was struggling to kind of figure out what I wanted to talk about. So, you know, I'm talking about comics, so you gotta have pictures, right? So once I decided, okay, you know, I want to write this dissertation on the Boondocks comic strip, I kind of started, that's when I really started to think about, okay, well, what is the importance of this? You know, why am I studying comics? You know, why do I think it's important? And when I first presented my dissertation topic, you know, my professors, who are, of course, generations older than me, were like, no, you know, this, like, what? Comics? Like, that's not what we do here. Like, what's that comic stuff? Because this was, what was it, 2007. So I don't know about here, but in America, nobody was studying comics from an academic, critical, sort of like, you know, socially significant perspective. And I was like, no, this is what I want to do. One, because I don't have anything else to write about. And two, that I think there's, you know, something new here and something important here that I can kind of bring to the mainstream. So I went ahead, I studied the Boondocks comic strip, and the title of my dissertation was The Continuity and Extension of African American Communication Dynamics in Black Comic Strips. And so I started to apply theory and really do a rhetorical study about the linguistic nature of the Boondocks comic strip and what it meant. Because this particular comic strip, the Boondocks, was written by an African American. The story is about an African American family. And the story was very culturally specific. And this really, you know, really kind of made me wonder, well, why is it so popular? There's only a handful of comic strips by a Black person, literally a handful, that are actually like nationally syndicated. And Boondocks was one of them. So I'm like, why is this so popular? You know, why is it cross-cultural? Why do people, you know, outside of just the Black community enjoy this comic? And so I really started to try to answer that question. My dissertation didn't really find the answer to that question, but it found some pretty interesting things about the work and about how the work was produced and about how the work is socially significant. So I first started to study sort of, you know, well, what are the African American communication dynamics that I'm talking about? So I applied the theory Afrocentricity. So there's a theory Afrocentricity that kind of really asks Black academics, even though you don't have to be a Black academic to use the theory, but it kind of asks you to connect some ancestral African dynamics, not just communication, but spirituality and kind of a African ethos to the language components and kind of the life experience of Black Americans. So that's what sort of Afrocentricity does. And that is how I ended up applying it to the Boondocks, and how I ended up seeing that, wow, this is really, really a socially significant sort of piece of work. So I looked at these sort of elements of African American vernacular English that are present in the comic strip. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. I also looked at this sort of idea of community harmony that was present in the comic strip. And I looked at an idea called signifying that's present in the comic strip. And then I said, well, what does that mean? Okay, these things are present that have some connection to sort of an ancestral African sort of ideology, but like, what does that mean? And so that's the question I ultimately ended up answering in the conclusion of my dissertation. So not necessarily, why is this thing cross-cultural, and why do so many people enjoy it, but more specifically, what is it doing for sort of the African American experience in America? So first, let's just talk about a little bit about African American vernacular English. So basically, when Africans were brought to America, obviously there was a language barrier, and part of the history and the development of sort of African American vernacular English is this kind of fusion between the native language spoken to an African and then American English. And so you get all of these interesting sort of linguistic rhetorical strategies, which now today, people will look down on. You're not supposed to talk like this, you're supposed to use proper English and that sort of thing. But that sort of very dialect and that sort of very distinct African American vernacular English is specifically connected to the slave trade and to how African Americans had to be very creative in sort of developing their sort of language strategies, but also hanging on to some of those ancestral African sort of ideals. So the language is a very powerful component in talking in showing you how things developed in history. And so you see those African American vernacular English elements in this particular comic strip. So let me give you some examples, because what I did was I actually created a coding sheet. So I said, okay, this is African American vernacular English. These are some examples. And then I looked through 200 to 300 comic strips, and every time I saw an example of African American vernacular English, I pulled it out, put it into my dissertation, and said, there it is, it exists. So, and there's rules to African American vernacular English as much as status quo in America likes to say it's not a language. There actually is some rules to African American vernacular English. So just two quick examples. Let's take the word South. I live down south, South. African American vernacular English, a black person might say South. So the TH actually equals an F. So obviously not sort of a version of English that you would go into a job interview and use, but again, a signifier of sort of the historical oppression of a particular people. Another example, the deletion of some final consonants. So let's take the word test, T-E-S-T. African American vernacular English would say test. So dropping off that sort of final consonant. So there were a lot of these different rules that I coded and applied to the comic strip, and then looked to see, okay, do these exist? And they existed very prevalently in the strip. And again, I said, wow, it's using these very specific cultural elements, but this comic strip is cross-cultural. I mean, it turned into a animated television series, which had never happened before for a black comic strip before. So not only did it connect with the black community, but the larger American community. And a lot of people in this a lot of people that kind of viewed the Boondocks kind of viewed it as sort of a stereotypical representation of black people. And I'll give you an example. So here in this picture, Granddad is in the middle. Granddad raises Riley and Huey. Huey is on the left. So Huey is like the protagonist of the story. Riley, right here on the right, is like the antagonist of the story. And they have kind of dueling ideologies. So Huey, there on the left, he's like, pro African Americans, like, all for like the revolution and liberation. He has sort of an intellectual perspective on life and social experience. And then Riley over here on the right is kind of the victim of like toxic black masculinity, kind of this hip hop ethos of like strength and power and violence and like affiliation with gangs and that sort of thing. So Riley really in the strip is like this commentary on sort of everything that can go wrong in sort of in a society that kind of embraces this kind of toxic masculinity that I'm going to go a little bit more into depth in later on. So that's kind of the kind of synopsis of the comic strip. So outside of African American vernacular English and those sort of things that I found interesting about the strip, there's also sort of community harmony, which is specific to this kind of theoretical framework, Afrocentricity. And the idea is that, you know, Africans have this sort of ethos of communalism, you know, being a community, not this sort of individualistic ideology that was internalized in American culture. So these people went from sort of like a communal way of thinking and viewing the world to this sort of individualistic view of, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, do it alone, you know, the kind of the typical rags to riches story that is so prevalent, a formula in media today. So I kind of looked for some elements of this communal ideology in the strip. And again, I kind of coded, okay, what do I mean by communalism? And every time I would see it, I kind of pull that out and put it in the dissertation. And Huey is sort of the embodiment of this kind of collective ideology, this communal ideology that sort of Afrocentricity talks about, like a focus on an African-centered perspective, a focus on, you know, the good of the community, a focus on, you know, kind of that idea that it takes a village to raise a child perspective instead of you have to do it on your own. So I coded for all those sort of examples in the comic strip. And then I also kind of looked at this idea of Nomo, Nommo. So in Afrocentricity, Nomo is the creative power of the word. Sort of like, you know, I'm speaking to you and there's some sort of power in the words that I'm speaking to you, and words can kind of really transcend into things that are kind of beyond our understanding. So in this sort of African ideology, it's the idea of storytelling as opposed to writing things down. So that's the sort of ideology that Afrocentricity kind of pushes. You know, the African people were sort of a people that placed a lot of value on the word and telling stories and passing stories down from generation to generation, as opposed to writing things down as a way to kind of solidify history. So obviously I was looking at the rhetorical dimensions of a comic strip, which is obviously a written form. It's not this sort of oral form. But what I did for the strip was I said, well, okay, what are some of the aspects of Nomo? You know, so there's a certain when you talk about rhetoric and you analyze the way people think, or people, the way that people speak. All of our kind of studies about public speaking and how people present and should present, and that the whole notion of being persuasive are from kind of Eurocentric perspectives. You know, I teach public speaking at a university, and it's all Eurocentric, meaning Aristotle, Socrates, you know, all those people. But what Afrocentricity is saying, well, no, there are some rhetorical strategies that were specific to sort of places like ancient Kemet or sort of Egyptian rhetoric that have roots in sort of African public speaking ideals. So I kind of applied those kind of rules of speaking to the actual comic strip. And there's a bunch of those different sort of Egyptian rhetorical practices, like the use of rhythm. So if anybody is familiar with like the black church, you go to a black church, they might be repetitive in the words they use to kind of evoke some emotion. There's this thing called call and response, where the preacher will speak and the audience will kind of respond and interject. You know, those sort of very specific cultural elements that I wanted to say, well, okay, well, even though this is a written word and I'm studying a comic strip, do I see sort of some of those things in the strip. So I kind of coded for those and looked for those where I could. So it was kind of a more of a creative way to kind of delve into this aspect of nomo, or the creative power of the word, through the comic strip. So that was sort of those African communication dynamics that I looked at in the strip. But I also, as I was doing this research, one of the critiques of sort of this framework of Afrocentricity is that it's actually a sexist, like it's a sexist perspective, like a lot of things. This particular theory didn't kind of take into account the value of women. And so as I was applying this sort of framework to the Boondocks, I realized, oh my goodness, this comic strip is sexist. Like as much as I loved it, it just never occurred to me that this comic strip is actually pretty sexist. I mean, you can just tell from this picture right here, there's no women. Where's the mother? Where's the grandmother, right? They live with their grandfather. But really throughout the entire strip and throughout this entire story being told about their lives, there's no mention of a black mother, of a black grandmother, or anything like that. And actually, and this might actually, for people that are familiar with the strip, you might actually be going like, yeah, actually you're right? And so then I started being like, well, what does this mean? Wow. So then that was a whole nother aspect of my dissertation that I then had to write about, of course, because, you can't just leave that part hanging. You got to talk about that a little bit. So actually the times in the comic strip that a woman is mentioned is actually when it's just the butt of a joke. For example, in the comic strip, there are a lot of what we call yo mama jokes. Does anybody know about the yo mama jokes? Okay, all right, you're with me, good. Right, so the strip actually uses like these yo mama jokes, and that really, in the comic strip at least, is the only time like they talk about black women. So I'm like, wow, like one of the strips I remember, Riley actually said, yo mama is so fat when she jumps in the air she gets stuck. That was a actual strip. So I'm like, wow, okay. So what does this mean? So I couldn't use Afrocentricity to kind of dig into the gender dynamics, because Afrocentricity didn't really consider the kind of female perspective and where they fit in on this whole kind of equation of collective harmony and all of those things. So I then went to looking at literature on Black masculinity. And also looking at this framework called symbolic annihilation. And so that got me talking about some of the gender dynamics in the strip. And just briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the Black masculinity stuff I found, because I think it's pretty interesting. I went to a framework called Cool Pose. Cool Pose, which basically is a framework that says, in America at least, Black men have to remain cool regardless of sort of the situation. So despite sort of the oppressive nature that Black men are living in the United States, they don't have the ability to kind of lose their cool, because it could cost them their life. So for example, let's think about a white police officer pulling over a Black male. So already there are some kind of interracial dynamics that are problematic with that sort of scenario. But the Black male in that scenario, his responsibility, if he doesn't want to be kind of shot for nothing, is to kind of remain cool. Put your hands on the steering wheel. Don't have the white officer feel like you are a threat in any way, because just your skin color is a threat in that situation to a police officer. And so this idea of cool pose actually extends into sort of relationship dynamics between Black men and Black women, where this sort of notion of being unemotional can't be just so easily turned on and off. And so it becomes this kind of power struggle in a Black relationship, where the male doesn't feel like he can be that emotional, full-fledged being that he should be. And so Cool Pose talks about a lot of these sort of cultural dynamics that influence the way that Black males sort of interact in the world, and how that kind of affects the Black family and the Black community. So I started to one, pull out examples in the strip that I saw that reflect sort of this Cool Pose conceptual framework. And one of those sort of elements is called playing the dozens, and playing the dozens is just those yo mama jokes, that sort of verbal wordplay that is actually has roots in sort of African American history. The yo mama jokes originated from Black people realizing that if someone can talk about your mother and you don't like wring them by the neck, then you have the ability to kind of go out in sort of this racist world and not lose your cool when someone calls you the N-word. That's basically where this sort of verbal play, the dozens thing kind of originated. And so you see all of those sort of historical elements in this modern comic strip. And I thought that was fascinating because just reading as a 23-year-old, I didn't realize that kind of all that stuff was going on. And then there's the idea of signifying that I mentioned. And signifying, the signifying element is the closest I've come to an answer to explain why the Boondocks comic strip was so popular among many races and many different generations and people. So signifying is this idea that things have double meaning, right? And so the Boondocks did a masterful job of creating this strip and content where everywhere you look in the comic strip, there's double meaning. So for example, I said that the main character's name was Huey. Well, Huey is actually a play on Huey Newton, who was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party in the United States. So right there, if you're reading it, you might just say, oh, his name is Huey. You might not know that history, right? But for an African American reading it, we automatically know that, okay, this particular character has sort of this Huey Newton Black Panther ethos, and it gives us some perspective about his sort of ideology and the way that he views life. Now, another person reading that, outside of having that shared cultural meaning, might not have thought about that. And so it creates all of these interesting reactions to the strip. So you see a comic strip and it might be funny and we all might be laughing at the same comic strip, but you're laughing at one thing and I'm laughing about something completely different when we're reading the same exact comic strip. And it's a lot of like those sort of, you can think about signifying as like inside jokes, right? Different communities are laughing at different things for different reasons. And so one strip that actually comes to mind that I think encapsulates this a little bit is, and I actually used this strip in my dissertation. It's a one panel strip, is one panel. And on the panel, it has the temperature outside. So it's really, really cold. I'm on Fahrenheit. I don't know what the conversion is for Celsius, but it's like 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which the number doesn't matter. It's really cold, right? And in the strip, it says 10 degrees Fahrenheit up in the right-hand corner. Huey's in the strip and Riley's in the strip and they're freezing, but they have like their coats on. They're waiting for the bus. They have their coats on. They're freezing. They're like, oh my goodness, it's so cold. So they're on the right side of the strip. And then on the left side of the strip, it's a white kid with shorts on, right? So when you see that strip, okay, it's funny. It's funny to me. It's really funny. As a Black person looking at it, you're like, yeah, that's funny because like that's what we think about white people. Not white people in general, but if you go to any college campus in the United States and it's really, really cold, you'll always see a white kid with shorts on and like all the Black people are cold, right? So when a Black person is looking at that strip, that's what they're thinking about. They're like, oh my goodness, this is a reflection of like society. Like this is the inside joke that we always have. Like white people don't get cold, right? And a white person looking at that strip is going to process that totally different. They might be laughing like, yeah, that's funny. Look at the cold Black people, but you're laughing at something completely different, right? Because you might not know that inside joke. So that's kind of what the signifying aspect is. And those examples are all over the strip. I'll give you one more. There's one strip in here where, again, this is another one panel. It's just one panel where Granddad is sending Huey and Riley to an elementary school called Edgar Hoover Elementary School, right? And on the panel, it just says Edgar Hoover Elementary School, right? And Huey, of course, because he's the kind of intellectual, kind of, revolution type kid. He's like, no, Granddad, I can't go to this school. Do you see the name of the school? And Granddad's like, no, you need to get the best education there is. And so the reason why that's funny is because Edgar Hoover was the like head of the FBI in the United States that was like tapping the phones of African Americans who were like trying to fight for like freedom and liberation and doing some really illegal stuff to kind of monitor them and kind of make their lives a living hell. So when you're reading that strip with that sort of shared cultural knowledge, it's like, it's funny, right? But when you don't have that shared cultural knowledge, you might be laughing at someone else, or you might be analyzing that in a completely different way that someone else is. And then outside of that, there are all of these sort of class elements. So even within one strip, even 10 black people that might be looking at one strip could be laughing at two different things. So for example, if a black person is reading a strip with that sort of African American vernacular English that I told you about, you know, let's say an upper class black person might be reading it and they might be thinking, oh yeah, that's funny. Look how those like lower class black people talk. They use this African American vernacular English that's never going to get them a job, right? But a black person that's in a lower class might be laughing at that particular strip for totally different reasons. And so that's why I think this particular comic strip that turned into an animated television series just did so well, because it had all of these sort of different elements. But the thing that was great to me is that it was very culture specific, and I thought that would that makes this particular comic strip sort of a cultural phenomenon. So that sort of that's where I started with comics. I started with the Boondocks, and from there I started realizing, wow, like, this medium is really important. You can do a lot of great things with this medium. You can reach and touch a lot of different people. And so from there, I did my dissertation, I graduated, and something just kept bothering me about the field of comics. 'Cause originally I wanted to do things on like gender. I wanted to do my dissertation on like stuff around gender, stuff around the LGBTQ community. But then I did this, and I realized, man, there's something to be said here. So my first book, Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, which Liam mentioned in the introduction, was my first book. It won an Eisner. I didn't even know what an Eisner was. When I wrote the book, I just wrote it because I was like, this book needs to be written. And then when the publisher one day emailed and said, oh, you've been nominated for an Eisner, I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And I just kind of like went along with the rest of my day. And then I was like, well, let me look this up. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool, right? But so, I wasn't going for that. I wrote the book because because it was important. So when I started working on this dissertation, I went to Howard University. It's a all black university. It's a historically black college / university, specifically built right after the Civil War so that black people can get an education, right? And so all the black books are there. Anything about black history is there, right? So I thought that I was just going to go to the library and find a book on the history of black people in comics. I was like, oh, I'm just going to go to the library to write my literature review on the history of black people in comics. There was no book. There's no book specifically about the history. I was looking at comic strips, so there was no book specifically about the history of black people in comics. It was so frustrating. I couldn't believe it. I found books on the American history of comics that didn't mention any black people. I found all these books about the history of comics, but nothing that just gave me a start to finish about the contributions of black people in comics. So I had to put together this literature review from all different types of sources and piece together the timeline. So when I finished my dissertation, that is why I wrote that first book. I said I don't want anybody else to be trying to do this research, and there's not a book that they can go to say, okay, here's when the first black person wrote their first comic, and here's sort of the progression and the trajectory. So basically, it was me trying to fill a void and to kind of say that black people have to be represented in sort of this American comics canon and history. And so I wrote Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, where the first chapter is the history of black people in black comic strips. Literally kind of copy and paste it from my dissertation. Not specifically, of course I had to change it around a little bit, but pretty much, straight from my dissertation. And in that, it's an edited book. So a lot of different people wrote chapters in that book. Nancy Goldstein, who's written about Jackie Orms, John Jennings, who's a really popular graphic artist in the United States. A lot of people wrote chapters in this book because I had only did a dissertation on the Boondocks, and I wasn't really steeped in comics literature. My background was only this at that point. And so I got all these people to write chapters, and the book just turned into something that people really felt was a kind of a valuable tool in sort of this literature around comics. So that was like my introduction research into comics. So after that first book, I kind of, I was like, all right, I'm done with the comics thing. I'm going to go back to just focusing on like gender and the LGBTQ community. So I kind of wrote a book on like LGBTQ issues. But then like I won the Eisner, and then like people just kept asking me about comic stuff. And in the industry of comics, what does everybody want to talk about? Superheroes. And like they would get really pissed off at me because I'm like, I don't know anything about superheroes. I know about the history of comics. Like I can tell you like some of the early Black people that were working in comics, but I can't tell you like what happened in issue 10 of Batman. And like, so for like comics people, that's not good. Like they're just like, what? Right? And so that sort of, my perspective on comics is so different from everybody else's in the industry, but that is what is going to help the comic book industry to continue to grow, but also to continue to survive. Being open to bring different people from different fields into the comics industry. So imagine like a person who studies physics or a biologist. Imagine those sort of people kind of engaging with the medium and writing their own stories. Imagine like the types of books and creative stories that we can come up with, that the industry sort of continues to go on this trajectory of, I don't like using the word inclusive because it's just like, oh God, I get tired of hearing inclusion. But, imagine how the field can grow and the stories we can tell if the field is sort of inclusive in the way that we get different people in different fields to sort of engage with this medium. So after Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, I still felt a need to kind of document this sort of history, document the contributions that Black people have made in the comics industry. It just really bothered me that, I'm trying to do this research. I'm sure there's like millions of other people trying to do research on Black comics that don't have the resources that they need. They can't just go to the library. So then I did the Encyclopedia of Black Comics. And the Encyclopedia of Black Comics, it's a book of over 100 entries specifically focused on Black people in the comics industry. And the book is interesting. I made it a point to have it, at least 50% of the book focus on entries about Black women, which again was really important to me because, as you know, a lot of times women, period, in the industry go unnoticed. So, we keep hearing about Stan Lee, rest in peace, Jack Kirby, and all of the same people. And it's like these other people that are doing great things in comics get lost. And then within that, women are very rarely mentioned, and their contributions in comics are very rarely mentioned. So I got a lot of flack for the Encyclopedia of Black Comics because obviously if the book is 50% Black women, then that means some Black men didn't make it in the book. So I got a lot of flack about that. But the thing is, men continue to write about men. So if you don't have a woman writing about women, then you continue this sort of kind of cycle of the industry being male dominated and us not hearing about the stories of women, which is why Trina Robbins' work is so important as well. So I did the Encyclopedia of Black Comics that published in 2017, and in that time span, people started asking me to write comics. So now I'm going from the academic, from the outside. It's easy to say, oh, that comics industry is racist. We're like, I'm not racist, sexist, sorry. Well, it's racist too, but sexist. It's easy to say it and critique it from the outside. But then as a writer, now I'm like inside. So it's like now I have the perspective of like the outsider, but I also have the perspective of the insider. And man, when I started writing comics, I realized the situation is a lot worse than I thought. Particularly the race part is bad, but particularly around the gender part, man, the way that women are treated in the writer's room sometimes is kind of astonishing. And now I can say that from kind of a first person perspective. So the first comic book that I actually was asked to write was with Lion Forge. It's a small comic book publishing company in the States, and they came to me and they wanted me to co-write a book, which I thought was great because it was my first book, and just to be able to co-write with someone, I co-wrote it with David Walker, who's like a monster in the field. He's been doing this work for a while, Iron Man, and he's written all those people. And I thought it would be great to learn from somebody like that from our first book. And so the book actually, they had an idea for the book. They just said, we want a superhero that has Down syndrome. And we want a superhero that has Down syndrome is what they said, but we also want the superhero with Down syndrome to be white, but we want him to have a black female best friend. And so that was kind of what they gave us, and then we had to come up with the story. And, that was perfect for me. If it was another book, I might have said no, but I was like, if I'm going to start writing comics, this is the perfect way for me to start, because it brings together all of the things that I already care about, representation of people who haven't been represented as superheroes before. I get to write about a black female superhero, because the black woman in the story, the female teenager in the story is a superhero too. So I get to kind of write about this relationship. I get to have sort of a say in how this black female character looks. A lot of times the black female superheroes, because they're written by men, like the men, I don't know if you know this, but like when black women jump into a swimming pool, like when they come out, their hair is like crazy, because like if it's a perm, when they come out, it's just crazy, it's unmanageable. So a lot of men writing black female characters like black women to come out the pool with beautiful hair. I still think black women's hair is beautiful when they come out the pool. It just doesn't look like what the men characterize it as. So, so I was able to be in the room to say, no, that's not what her hair should look like. And, she shouldn't be walking around with her like boobs hanging out because she's 18. So I was able to have some say in the room, and it's a power struggle. It's a power struggle when you're in the room with a bunch of male writers. And as a female writer in the industry, you do have to pick and choose your battles. Sometimes it's just like, all right, forget it. You can have that. And then sometimes it's like, no, like this is really important. Like, this female character shouldn't be doing that, or that, I just can't put my name on this. So, you have to pick and choose your battles. And it becomes that sort of power dynamic. Now, right before I did Superb is the comic book that I was just talking about with the superhero with Down syndrome, which was just a really amazing project to be able to kind of represent a superhero that really hasn't been represented before in comics. We talk about like superheroes and beyond. I believe that's a perfect example of like, beyond this sort of notion that we have of what a superhero should be and look like and think like, right? But right before I had been asked to write that comic book, I actually did a documentary film. I actually produced, directed, and wrote a documentary film called Remixing Colorblind, and I'm going to tell you why it was important that I did the film first and then got into comics, into writing comics. So the film was on how the educational system shapes our perception of race, right? And really the film was like my journey on trying to understand my perspective on race. So I went to a historically black college for my PhD. All black professors, all black people, right? But before that, I had went to predominantly white universities for my master's and for undergrad, right? Between my master's and undergrad education, so 6 years, I had one full-time black teacher. That's numerous classes, 6 years, right? One black teacher. And then I went to Howard and had all black teachers, right? And then I got the job at Rider University, which is predominantly white faculty. And so, and remember, I was young, so by the time I finished my dissertation at Howard, I was only 26. So I'm like, a faculty member working with like 60-year-olds, right, that are all white. So, I'm like, wow, I just sat back one day and I was like, well, how did I get here? How did I get here, right? I think being a faculty member is definitely a privileged position, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, and that stuff. It's definitely a privileged position. And so I started to think, well, how have my ideas of race been shaped, and how did the educational system force me to think about race in particular ways? And I was really thinking about my young students. So, these young students are at Rider University where I work, which is predominantly white. And just when you walk around a campus, you start to think about how certain values and ideals are reinforced. So let's take a black student walking around Rider University. All of the faculty are white. all of the sort of images that you see on the halls. You know, at a college campus, they have pictures of like awesome professors that have come through there and administrators. But then you go to like the cafeteria and all the workers are black. And so I started to think, well, that definitely shapes our perception of, like, that definitely shapes how we see ourselves and how we see others without even saying anything, just walking in the visuals on a college campus. So I did the documentary Remixing Colorblind, and without getting too deep into what the documentary was about. In order to write the documentary, you know, to write the script, you have to give direction to the videographer and the editor. You know, this is what I want this scene to look like. This is what I want how the story to be told. This is the shot that I want you to capture when we go in to do this interview. All of these things that basically set me up to kind of already know how to write comics before I wrote my first comic book, right? And I didn't even realize that was happening. So it's kind of like this like weird coincidences for me in the comic industry, where like all of these things just keep setting me up to like stay in the comic industry. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to do something else, and it just keeps coming back. So I think I'm gonna stay in it a little bit longer. And so when I wrote my first comic book, of course there was a learning curve, but just that idea of, you know, I'm writing a panel, you have to give direction to the artist, you have to tell them how the shot is gonna look, you have to tell them what they want to see in the panel. Writing the documentary just was a natural progression and really helped me to kind of get that mindset of writing a comic. One thing I will mention that at first was a struggle for me writing a comic book is, you know, when you're writing comic books, there's panels. So like I would just write like, oh, Huey, open the microwave. No, you can't just open the microwave in a comic book. Like it probably takes like 3 panels to open the microwave in a comic book, because first, like, the microwave has to be in the first panel. Huey's got to be in front of it. The second panel, he's got to put his arm out. And then the third panel, he can open the microwave. He can't just open the microwave in one panel. So those sorts of things were like interesting learning curves to writing comics. And then right now, I'm working on an actual graphic novel. And it's so weird. And I kind of sometimes feel bad saying this, but now people just keep asking me to write things. If you're in the writer's world, you know, usually it's you trying to get work, but for some reason, for me, like, people just want me to write things, right? So I got asked to write a graphic novel. Temple University in Philadelphia got a huge Pew Research grant to write a graphic novel on Black civil rights leaders in Philadelphia. And so they wanted me to write it, so they approached me and asked me to write it. It's a really big book. It's like 150 pages. And when I first met with them, I was like, so you want me to write some of them and then bring on some other writers, right? They're like, no, we want you to write the whole thing. So that's a 2-year project that I'm working on now. We're about, I think we're about 6 months in. And the cool thing about this book is it's about Black civil rights leaders in Philadelphia. So I'm actually learning a lot about the history of Philadelphia. Like even like streets that I would drive up for the last 30 years of my life. I had no idea like the historical meaning of like these street names. And now I kind of know all of the history of Philadelphia. But the coolest thing about this book is it's for the Philadelphia public school system. So it will be distributed in all of the public schools in Philadelphia. And I don't know how they're going to implement it into the curriculum, but it will be a book that will be distributed, and it's going to be free to all the public schools in Philadelphia. So I'm writing for that sort of teenage age range, like 8th to 12th grade. So it's a pretty awesome project. And then beyond that, I'm writing another book for Lion Forge, but I also have like all of these other ideas that I want to kind of, you know, I'm always looking for creative ways to kind of share my research and tell different stories. And so I think the next thing I want to focus on in the last 2 or 3 years is using this comics medium to actually talk about same-sex domestic violence and domestic abuse. And to kind of bring that issue to the forefront. I kept thinking, you know, how, you know, talking about domestic violence and domestic abuse is a difficult thing, because obviously you can't just come out and tell your story because you're a victim of domestic violence and domestic abuse, right? So I'm thinking about getting people to anonymously share their stories with me, and then put that in sort of a graphic novel format in which the victim in each story is the hero. So these will be stories about people who experienced this, got themselves out of the situation, in each story, the victim is the hero. And so that's where I think that, you know, I'm just going to keep using this medium as a social impact tool, like I mentioned at the beginning, and to try to just bring all of these sort of issues to light. So, yeah. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I'll just ask one and then maybe shut up. I was thinking, just because, you know, we're at a superhero conference, and I was thinking that idea in Afrocentrism of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And you think that is maybe sometimes at odds with the superhero, because the superhero is all about the individual, the exceptional individual who rises above, and it's about kind of heroes above rather than within the community.
Right.
And then that kind of Afrocentric view, obviously, is about community. So do you think that sometimes is why there might be a tension?
So, and that's why I think that sort of mythology and that sort of cosmos is important for the comics community, so that we're not stuck in telling stories from one particular ideology, because otherwise, how is the field going to grow and develop? And so, I mean, Black Panther is a great example. You know, I think if I apply that same methodology that I applied to the Boondocks to Black Panther, I think I would come out with some of the sort of the same findings around these elements of community, these elements of collective agency, and these sort of elements around Afrocentricity. And we can see already what the movie Black Panther has done for the comics industry. So,
absolutely. I mean, one of the things that was probably startling about that movie was it's called Black Panther, but it could have been called Wakanda, because the supporting cast were so dominant in that film in a way that we haven't seen in any superhero movie.
Yeah, and you know, T'Challa in that movie needed his communities to survive, otherwise he would have died, right? So that sort of
several times,
right. So that sort of reverse mythology that we haven't seen as much in the mainstream comics. And I want to be clear, because in comics, there's a lot of diversity in comics. There's just not as much diversity in the mainstream comics when we're talking about DC and Marvel. But there's stories for everything, every ethnicity in the comics industry. If you know, it's like the difference between like listening to music. Either you only listen to the stuff on the radio, or you actually listen to like the underground stuff and the other stuff that's happening.
Cool. Now I'm going to see, I'm sure there's loads of questions, so maybe have we got any questions yet? Have we got a microphone? Do you want to just yell out from where you are?
Short question.
Sure.
Thanks, Sheena. Great presentation. I want to know why you don't like the Boondocks animated.
Oh, I knew that was coming. So did you ever see the animated show?
I love the comic, but I never actually watched the show.
Oh, good. I like you already. It's probably for the best. So the comic strip was very, it had a lot of wit. It was socially relevant. You know, he commented on relevant social issues. And like I said in my presentation, it was sexist, but not in a way that was belligerent. And the animated show, which, you know, it's a different medium, so there's a whole production team. There's all of these different perspectives and people working on it. It was just belligerent. Like, it was belligerently sexist and homophobic. Like, you know, even some of the episodes I watched, like, there's like this Black female stripper that's dating granddad, just all this crazy stuff that I felt like, you know, the message that the comic strip shared and the impact of the comic strip just wasn't there in the television show, because it was clouded by all of the extremities of these isms, sexism, heterosexism, and all that stuff.
Any more questions? We've got one here from Aidan.
Thank you for a really illuminating presentation. I have a very long reading list now.
Oh,
so
good.
Thank you. I had a question about Nomo, which was a totally new concept. Oh, there's the microphone. So that was a totally new concept for me, and thank you very much for introducing it. Yeah. But I was wondering how you think that kind of plays into the formal qualities of comics, which often use dialogue to kind of relate the story. It especially more contemporary comics rely less on like captioning and kind of summing up what's happening, but mainly to the interactions between the characters, or even the character kind of giving a first-person account. Do you think that plays into the idea of Nomo, or would be elucidated by that concept at all, or not so much?
So that's an interesting question, because like I said, Nomo is the creative power of the word, and I applied Nomo very creatively and maybe a little bit unorthodox to the Boondocks comic strip because it's a written form, but I think that Nomo can be used in comics as a part of the storytelling. So, you know, if I'm talking about, you know, a black family, or it doesn't even have to be a black family, but in this scene, you know, the grandmother or grandfather is sharing a story that's been passed down for generations and generations. You know, that's a way that you can see Nomo in the storyline of a book, even though it's the written form. And I think you know, it's just a value system. You know, some cultures are going to value, you know, these stories passed down from generation to generation, but through a Western lens, you know, everything is the written word. It has to be written. If it's not written, then it's not real, right? And so it's just those different ideologies. But I think that you can use Nomo as a mechanism of telling the story and showing that is important for these stories to be passed down from generation to generation. You can think about your own sort of family immigrant stories. Like, we all have, in America at least, we all have an immigrant story, because nobody was there in the first place except for the Native Americans. And you talk to students, they can tell you, no, this is where my grandparents came from. This is where their story, this is where they're from. That's Nomo, right? That's a creative power of the word that gives you a spiritual connection to your ancestors. And it kind of transcends your way of thinking. Now, for African Americans in America, you know, it sucks because we can't tell that story, because, you know, our records were cut off when we were brought to the South, and then whoever we were connected to in Africa or West Africa are discarded. So there's almost no way that I can, you know, I can't tell you my great grandparents' story because it was erased. And so I think your question is important, because, you know, we can kind of value that power of the word and attribute it to that sort of African ethos and where that sort of actually understanding of the power of the word actually came from.
And then what's interesting, of course, in comics is it's text, but it's kind of visual text. Mm-hmm. So whether it's kind of hand lettered or whether it's a sound effect that's given a kind of graphic quality, so it kind of has almost the kind of tactility of the spoken word in a way that the rigid typeface of a newspaper or a book doesn't. How have you, in creating your own comics, because you're writing them, dealt with the artists to make sure that when they're trying to make a character look from a certain background, that they don't tip into cliche or stereotype, but at the same time do what comics need to do, which lets you know in one panel, because that's sometimes all you have, that this person is from this background.
Yeah, so that's been a little bit difficult, because, you know, even as a writer, you're still sort of in this male-dominated industry, at least right now. At least if you're writing for a publishing company, you know, if you're in the writer's room as a female, you're probably in the writer's room with majority males, and just trying to think about, well, how can we actually be a little bit, I don't even want to say authentic, because, you know, women can come in all different shapes and sizes, but just pulling away from those stereotypes. It's hard for men to, you know, they want to see certain things. They have this ideal of beauty, and women have this internalized idea of beauty. So just kind of, I think pushing back on that, and as a male pushing back on, I mean, aren't you guys tired of seeing the same type of woman? I mean, I know I am, right? It's just like, oh, really? So just kind of pushing back on that. And just, you know, one of the things I do like about Lion Forge is their motto is actually comics for everyone. And so their assumption is that it's going to be diverse. So, you know, they're purposeful about putting different, not just ethnicities, but sexual orientations and different mythologies in their books. So just getting to a place where more publishers and individuals are purposive about the visuals.
How did they arrive at that ethos? I mean, because you said they came to you and said, you know, the one thing they had for Superb was the character needs to
have Down syndrome,
and that seems, you know, as a starting point, an unusual place for a publisher to begin.
Yeah, the owner of Lion Forge, I believe he has a family member with Down syndrome. At least from the interviews, that's what he said, and so he wanted to tell that sort of type of story. And actually, for the book Superb, we actually got endorsed by the National Society of Down Syndrome, who actually, and this is a very important point, they read all of our scripts and said yes or no. Not that they had the final say, but if you're writing about a community that you're not a part of, you need a sensitivity reader so that you get it right, because this might be the only representation of a superhero with Down syndrome for years, right? So you want to make sure that you're not doing more harm than good. So that was actually really important. One example of why that was important, in one of our early comic books for Superb, me and the co-writer, we wanted to use the word retard. Like we had the kid in school, and one of the other classmates called him retarded, which, you know, kids are mean. And in our perspective, like, kids are mean. This is actually what's going to happen. And the National Down Syndrome Society said no. Like, why? Like, why do you have to? No. So we actually ended up taking that out, which was a good thing. It was a good thing to have them read that and give us feedback on, you know, that's going to do more harm. That's one of those examples of, yeah, but that's going to do more harm than good, right?
Got any other questions? Yep, take them all.
Right here. Dr. Howard, first I want to say your great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Actually, I have two questions. One, as a PhD student at Temple University, I'm kind of curious.
You're a PhD student at Whoa. Yeah. Aren't we in Australia?
When you brought up Afrocentricity and some of the limitations that when it dealing with gender, and I know as well as sexuality, I'm just kind of curious is what will be your response? Because Dr. Asante and Dr. Mazama and others would vehemently disagree with you on that. And then the second one is, although the comic book industry is very, as a whole, diverse, obviously the big two, Marvel and DC, kind of set the tone for what the industry is going to happen. So what do you think, as far as Marvel and DC is concerned, when it comes to, I guess, inclusive representation, and how would you deal with that? Because I know they had World of Wakanda. After the movie came out, the Dora Milaje was really popular. They had the World of Wakanda, 6 issues, it was done. Now they came back again with that Dora Milaje kind of spin-off, but partner them up with X-Men and Spider-Man. So how would you just kind of, what do you see happening, particularly when it comes with the big two? So.
Great. Got a Temple University student here. So a funny story, somebody asked me if I wanted Malefia Santi on my dissertation committee. I was like, no, I want to graduate. Like, I don't want him on my committee. I want to get out of here. But Malefia Santi is the creator of Afrocentricity, the theory that I was just talking about. He's still a professor at Temple University, I think. Really, really big name, amazing. He's the chair, right? So I don't see how you can push back on Afrocentricity being sexist, because it's written, it's out there, but it has evolved since the beginning. So, you know, he's published a number of books, and I think he's heard the critiques, he's taken the critiques, and it has evolved. But I think if you look at Afrocentricity and say like womanist theory, you can see that womanist theory is saying that black men and black women are equal. You know, this is a theory to help further value black women. Black men or black women are equal, and it's a stated purpose. In Afrocentricity, you don't see that purposive statement in there. And so, but I do think that he's evolved in his subsequent books, which is how we learn, right? Take the criticism, and that's how theories build and stay and have longevity. And then that second part about sort of DC and Marvel evolving, you know, I think it's interesting that, you know, one of the scenes in Black Panther that was taken out was sort of this kind of lesbian relationship with the Dora Milaje, and I always say the characters' names wrong, but that scene was kind of taken out in Black Panther, and it just signals to me that, you know, we're just not there yet. It's a slow progression, and that the slow progression is difficult to swallow, but you can see that, you know, we're making steps to kind of be inclusive of everybody, even with DC and Marvel, which a lot of their stuff comes down to like, is this going to make money or not? And honestly, if it doesn't make money, then the company's not going to survive, so you can't really fault them for that. But I do see in particularly Marvel, because I don't know what DC's doing, but particularly Marvel, I do see a slow progression. Now, I do want to see a black lesbian female superhero, but the question is, and I hate to say it, you know, would that sell? I think if it's a spinoff of something from Black Panther, that it would. And I think actually Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he was writing Black Panther, he did depict a lesbian relationship. He did it really well. Like, it was really good. You know, it didn't look like something that a man would write. Like, it wasn't like a sort of a fetish thing. Like, we just want to see these two women make out. I actually think that Ta-Nehisi Coates' version of writing that sort of lesbian relationship in his Black Panther books is actually a great starting point for what we need to be doing, at least for that sort of aspect of representation. Yeah, but, you know, DC and Marvel are really not going to change unless there's another company that really gets to their level and shows them that this is how it should be done, and this is how they can do it. Otherwise, you know, there's no pulling force to make them kind of really stretch over to being a little bit more diverse. But they're making progress. It's obvious they're making progress.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the role that images play in your work as a scholar, and particularly with these concepts like signifying or other concepts from Black studies. You use the term rhetorical analysis, which can be applied to images, I think, but I'd just be curious to hear you talk more about how you approach that.
So the few examples that I gave you of the Boondocks, if you remember me mentioning, you know, the example of sort of them out at the bus stop and it's really cold, or Huey going to the Edgar Hoover School. Those panels were like, the text on them were limited. It might be 3 or 4 words. And so you're deducing meaning from the actual visual. Like, without the visual, it's not funny, right? And so that's one of the things I had to learn writing comics too. Less words are better. The images are really important in telling the story, and the images really get you that sort of signifying sort of a double meaning that I was talking about. Yeah.
Got Neil up the back. Was there one down here first? Oh, Taylor, yeah.
But also, one other thing to that question that I think is interesting too, like Superb, the main character has Down syndrome, and one of the things that, you know, we were talking about in the writer's room, well, you know, people with Down syndrome have very specific facial features. Like, if you see a person with Down syndrome, you know, because they're very specific facial features. And so one of the things that you know, the artist had to kind of be sensitive about was, you know, how do we draw this character? Do we draw him as someone that looks, you know, like he has Down syndrome or not? And if you look through the book, you can see you can see that sort of tension playing out. Like, some of the books you can really tell, and some of the books you wouldn't be able to tell at all unless somebody told you this character had Down syndrome. So that sort of visual element was, yeah, it's really, really sensitive, kind of fine line, right?
Hi, that was really, really great. Thank you
thanks.
so much. I'm really interested in the concept of cool pose that you mentioned. And for me, it kind of called to my mind Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectional feminist theory.
You guys are good.
In which, you know, she says women of color are largely ignored from feminist discourse, and they're also largely ignored from anti-racist discourse. And she often tries to discuss the fact that women are subject to men's violence, but also Black women are often subjected to the violence of white male police officers in a way that isn't discussed. So I'm wondering how women fit into cool pose and how that kind of affects the representation of women in comics, if you can speak to that.
Yeah. So cool pose, if like you're interested in that sort of masculinity dynamic, it's a really awesome book to read, and it's really not thick at all. Like, it's a small book. Like, you can probably read it in like a few days, and it's all about Black men in the way that all of the different ways that they've had to deal with oppression, from sort of internalized Eurocentric values to just being under constant threat, to that sort of American cultural logic that men have to be the head of the household, they have to bring home the money, they have to be the one to make decisions. But then how do you do that when you're living in a oppressed society that won't even allow you to make the same sort of wage and have the same sort of jobs? And so it methodically lays all of that out, down to the point where it explains
why black men get involved with guns, because they don't really feel like they have not guns gangs, because they don't really like, they want to feel like they have a community that's sort of viewing the police as their own gang that is sort of puts them under attack, and all those sort of things. So it kind of methodically lays out all of that, and within there they talk about how all of those different dynamics affect the black family, and specifically how black men then communicate with black women in the relationships that they have. Because if you have to do all of that in order to live, then how can you come home and just turn that off and be sort of a loving, sensitive, caring, kind of soft guy when you come home to your family? You really can't, right? It's kind of impossible to just turn that on and off. And so in that context, that's how it fits in sort of the black female. But the book is specifically laying out this cool pose dynamic for black masculinity, and then how all those sort of internalized Eurocentric ideals just affect every aspect of like black love, basically. Yeah.
I think Neil was next up there.
Hi, thanks, Sheena. Great talk. I'd just like to ask your opinion on Afrofuturism. People talk about it's got a bit of a history, obviously, but people talk about it in relation to Janelle Monáe and the Black Panther movie. So I just wondered what you have to say about its role.
Yeah, so in Philly, actually, Afrofuturism is kind of a cool thing. Like, they do a whole Afrofuturism like gala every year. So this big thing is really cool. But Afrofuturism for me is really just about telling stories where black people can reimagine sort of their futures, but also kind of retell history. And in a lot of Afrofuturist work, retells history from the perspective that what would have happened if black people weren't brought to America and enslaved. How would that have changed society? Where would we be now? Would this room even look the same? Maybe it would be all black people sitting here, right? Like, it's just Afrofuturism is like this sort of reimagining of those sort of different scenarios, and that in a sense I think gives the black community kind of a sense of kind of freedom, a sense to think outside sort of these rigid boxes that we've been forced to think inside of for so long. Yeah. Maybe we have time for one more, Ewan? Yeah, let's just keep going. Yeah. There's Darren there in the middle.
Hi, Sheena. Thanks for your talk, and I'm really impressed in the way that you talk without slides. It's like your own superpower. You know what? So I just realized that I didn't flip through any of them. I told you when I there's slides there. They're like 8, but anyway, go ahead. I was really interested in the way that you speak about your journey as an academic, and you make it sound almost like it's just happened by accident, but it seems like that you've chased your passions and you've done things that you're interested in, and it's a room full of academics who are chasing the research goals and targets. So I hoped you could speak a bit more about how you approach your career and academia in general. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think that is I think that's a really important question. And this is what I tell like my students too. I'm like, if you're gonna go to college, major in something that you're interested in. A lot of kids are going to college, they don't even know why. Their parents told them to major in like engineering or all this stuff they don't care about because certain jobs are going to guarantee you a certain sort of lifestyle. And I like to tell people, if you love what you do, you'll make money doing it, because you're gonna work that much harder because you're passionate about the thing. And that's just my perspective. Like, even if it's a field where people are saying, it's hard to make money in this field, you can't do it, don't you want a certain type of lifestyle? I think if you're passionate about the thing that you're doing, you will find ways to make money and sustain yourself doing that thing. And I think that has been my perspective from the beginning. So I have an undergraduate degree in business. I have a graduate degree in graphic design. And I have a PhD in intercultural and rhetorical communication, because at each stage in my life, those are the things I thought I was interested in until I like figured it out. So when in undergrad, I was like, I want to major in marketing. I want to go to the business school. I want to do that, because when I looked down the roster of majors, I was like, that seems really interesting, right? And I finished, and I was like,
I don't know where I want to work. What am I going to do with a business degree? You know? So then I was like, okay, I'm interested in graphic design. At that time I drew a little bit, and that was just, you know, I didn't really think about how am I going to make money out of this, which is why I stayed in school until I got a PhD, because I was like, all right, I got a major in graphic design, but where am I going to work? And so I didn't figure out really what I wanted to do until I got to graduate school. And I think if you just follow I think the answers are in you. Like you're internally telling yourself you're moving in the direction. If you listen to yourself, you're moving in the direction that you want to go. And then eventually you get to a place where you're doing something that you love and you can make money doing it. And just like my dissertation, it was like, oh, I love the Boondocks. I don't care if you guys don't care about comics. I want to graduate, and this is what I'm interested in, because I have to write a 150-page dissertation about this. And so I think listening to your internal voice and following it regardless of what everybody else is telling, because it's really easy to get sucked into other people's dreams for you. And it's really hard to kind of listen to that internal voice, but I think that's what you got to do. And I think that's why I just keep being propelled in this sort of certain way. Because if somebody asks me to write something, let's say next year I decide I don't want to write any more comics, I'm just gonna stop. Like, it's because I can't do it unless I'm passionate about it. Even when I did the documentary, I just wanted to do it. I just woke up one day and said, I want to do a documentary. I taught myself Final Cut Pro and I edited the thing, right? And even like in America, like we have this whole tenure system for being a professor. You got to be there 5 years and you got to go up for 10 years. It's all this crazy stuff. And a lot of people research kind of what the university tells them to research. Like, you got to stick to this one thing because they want to get tenure. Me, I was like, well, I want to do that. Like, I just research what I want to research, and then the pieces fall into place. Because, you know, if I didn't get tenure, at least I'd be like researching stuff I cared about, right? Because you can make a career out of anything, if you're passionate about it. So that's just, I think, how it's happened for me. Like, I have a book called Black Queer Identity Matrix, which has nothing to do with comics. It's all about like Black female lesbian identity, you know, because that's just what I wanted to do. And so just, you know, stay listening to yourself is what I think is how I think my progression has happened. Yeah.
I think that's a great point to finish on. Sheena's books, superb, and the Encyclopedia of Black Comics are available downstairs in the bookstore. And I'm sure if you buy them, Sheena will sign them. Yes. And so please join me in thanking Dr. Sheena C. Howard. That's good. Cool. I think we have a short break before the next set of panels.